By 1880, there had been two major waves of Jewish immigration to the United States. The first wave began by accident, with wayward refugees from Dutch Brazil washing up in New Amsterdam in 1654. Over the next century and a half, more and more Jews arrived in a handful of cities, mostly coming from Western Europe, North Africa, and the Caribbean. Without a large enough Jewish population to support an Orthodox lifestyle, and no legal restrictions forcing them to do so, a certain style of Judaism emerged in which strict orthodoxy was abandoned outside the home and the synagogue, but Jewish identity and feeling were displayed with pride. The next wave of Jewish immigrants found this style, which they called Minhag America, very appealing. Throughout the mid-19th century, Jewish immigrants began arriving in much larger numbers from Germany, Austria, and Italy. These were people who had grown up steeped in the new religious streams of Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox Judaism. And for much of this period, America's first rabbis sought to unite American Jewry under these banners. But American Jews, as it turns out, had no interest in such religious unification. And that was fine. By 1880, the U.S. was home to 250,000 Jews, the sixth largest community in the world. Jewish politicians, celebrities, and businessmen were no longer a novelty. Anti-Semitism had become a rarity. The Jewish American story was over.
Between 1881 and 1914, the U.S. experienced mass immigration on a scale never seen before or since, and for the Jewish world, the seeds of this phenomenon had been planted a couple decades earlier. To meet the demands for industrial workers during the American Civil War, Congress passed the 1864 Immigration Act, which established a new immigration commission to oversee entry into the country based at Castle Garden in New York City. Under this law, immigrants were able to enter the country either by paying their own way, having a sponsor in the U.S., or pre-signing a U.S. labor contract that included transportation. This law didn't actually remain in effect for very long. In 1868, it was repealed over fears that the labor contract clause constituted indentured servitude, which had just become illegal under the new 13th Amendment, which also outlawed slavery. But most importantly, the office of the Immigration Commissioner remained in place, with subsequent immigration laws refining the process to exclude convicted criminals, the mentally ill, the physically disabled, and the Chinese.
During this same period, President Ulysses S. Grant made the bold choice to appoint Jewish lawyer Benjamin Franklin Peixoto as U.S. consul in Romania. At the time, Romania's liberal revolutionary government had fought to restrict the political and economic rights of Jews while expanding them for everyone else, so Peixoto's appointment was a real statement. Peixoto took his role extremely seriously, acting as both a protector of Romania's Jews and as a symbol of U.S. opposition to anti-Semitism. He might have taken it a little too seriously, because in 1872 he made an offhand and totally unauthorized suggestion to evacuate all 200,000 Romanian Jews to the U.S. This was not a remotely popular idea among Jewish advocacy groups or the American political establishment, but it almost certainly planted the idea that mass emigration could be a viable path of liberation for Eastern Europe's Jews. An idea that began in Romania soon spread to the neighboring Russian Empire, which was home to both the world's largest Jewish community and one of the world's least free. Following the accession of arch-reactionary Emperor Alexander III, widespread violence by hardline monarchists and a new series of civil and military regulations against Jews inflamed discussions of mass emigration. and unlike in the previous decade, Britain and the US had become far more sympathetic to the plight of Russian Jewry, while Western Jewish aid organizations had adopted a much more pragmatic stance on the Jewish question in Eastern Europe. So over the course of the decade, the American Jewish population grew by a whopping 60%. But that was a drop in the bucket compared to the surge in immigration which took place in 1891, when Congress passed a new Immigration Act which, among other things, expanded the Office of Immigration at Castle Garden into the much larger Bureau of Immigration headquartered on nearby Ellis Island, which could process several times as many immigrants in a single day. At the same time, the Russian government attempted to distract from an ongoing famine by revoking the useful status of the Jews of Moscow and expelling them to the Pale of Settlement to which most other Jews were confined, only accelerating the exodus from the empire. By 1891, this was already the largest migration in Jewish history, and it was clearly far from over. But despite US trepidation over receiving such a large quantity of immigrants, US President Benjamin Harrison and his progressive allies in Congress remained committed to welcoming these new arrivals as a demonstration of American values in contrast to Imperial Russian intolerance. Immigration to the US actually fell in the mid-1890s due to a global economic depression, but it quickly ramped up again as the century came to an end. For Jews, this reached unprecedented heights in the mid-1900s, in reaction to the Kishinev massacre in Russian-controlled Moldova, the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, the mass murder of Jews by the Russian supremacist Black Hundreds following the war's end, and perhaps most crucially, the end of open immigration in Britain. Altogether, between 1881 and 1914, just over 2 million Jews immigrated to the US, making up 9% of all immigrants and 12% of all net immigrants. If it sounds like I'm rushing through this, it's because I've actually covered most of these events in several other videos that you should check out if you haven't already. Today I'm more interested in what happened when people arrived in America. And to start, how did they get there?
The immigration process usually took a few weeks, but sometimes longer. Jews traveling out of the Pale of Settlement would mostly take the train out of the Russian Empire to a port of departure in Western Europe, such as Hamburg, Bremen, Rotterdam, and a multitude of other ports. The Hamburg-America line and the Holland-America line were some of the most popular ship lines to take for Jewish immigrants. And yes, that's the same Holland-America line that now runs as a cruise line. The main port of arrival in the US was New York City, although many Jewish immigrants would also arrive through Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, and other ports.
It's true, none of the Aranos came through New York.
But New York was by far the largest, and in 1892, a new immigration center called Ellis Island was built to handle the massive volume of immigrants arriving there. Before arriving at Ellis Island, immigrants would pass by the recently constructed Statue of Liberty, emblazoned with the poem The New Colossus by the Jewish-American poet Emma Lazarus. Once they arrived at the Bureau, it would take about 3 to 5 hours to go through the inspection process, assuming everything was in order. There was a health check by on-site doctors and a legal check to verify all paperwork was in order and correct. A lot of myths surround Ellis Island, which cast a negative view on its legacy and makes it seem like a draconian entity, but in reality, it made the immigration process a much more efficient and pleasant process. One of these myths, which absolutely angers the hell out of genealogists like myself, is the myth that family names were changed at Ellis Island. No names were changed at Ellis Island. It never happened, not once. The lists at Ellis Island were manifest records which were then used by the inspectors to process the passengers, but these did not follow them for life. It'd be the equivalent of a gate agent at the airport spelling your name wrong. Ellis Island even employed dozens of immigrant inspectors of different origins who spoke many languages, so the manifest records will often have fairly correct surnames to the original. For those immigrants interested in naturalizing, the process of becoming a US citizen required 5 years of residency. The first step was a declaration of intention, which was a document stating they renounced their allegiance to their previous foreign government. It took about 2 or 3 years before the next step of filing a petition of naturalization, which included an oath of allegiance. if accepted, and not everybody was accepted, then the immigrant would be sworn in and receive a certificate of citizenship.
Now, when we think of immigrant housing in this period of American history, we usually think of tenements. The word tenement dates back to 17th century Scotland and originally referred to any apartment building, but by the 19th century it had come to describe low-quality housing for the poor. When Americans hear the term tenement, their minds usually go to New York in the late 19th century, and with good reason, as they were particularly common housing for newly arrived immigrants in that city. The archetypal tenement layout was known as a railroad flat, because each room in an apartment led into the next rather than connecting through a hallway, all within a row of buildings usually 4 or 5 stories tall. Privacy was non-existent, and this was made worse by the fact that landlords would habitually rent out individual rooms within an apartment to entire families, which far exceeded the capacity of their primitive outhouses and made any kind of sanitation impossible. By the end of the 19th century, some parts of the Lower East Side had a population density of over 1,000 residents per acre, which is unimaginable today, and is also the main reason why Manhattan has a much lower population now than it did 120 years ago. At various points during the latter half of the 19th century, states had passed regulations attempting to combat these poor conditions. For example, New York's 1879 Tenement House Act, requiring that all rooms in an apartment have windows to access light and fresh air. But loopholes in these laws meant that little changed. To enforce the window requirement, for example, architects simply created small, enclosed, and unsanitary air shafts between individual buildings. But this wouldn't last much longer. And in fact, by the time most Jewish immigrants of this period arrived in the US, tenements were already in decline. In 1890, muckraking photojournalist Jacob Riis, himself an immigrant who had lived in the tenements, published his exposé How the Other Half Lives, which finally brought the squalor of the Lower East Side to the attention of the broader American public, and put more pressure on government than ever before to make substantive regulations. In 1901, the state of New York passed a new Tenement House Act, which closed a lot of the earlier legal loopholes and set way stricter regulations on fire safety, access to utilities, fresh air, and natural light, and most importantly, placed government oversight on landlords, which ended the construction of tenements entirely. While almost every major American city had existing tenements, the only other city where they housed Jewish immigrants in significant numbers was San Francisco, in an industrial area called South of Market. But unlike in New York, where some of the old tenement buildings are still standing, San Francisco's tenements were all destroyed in the Great Earthquake and Fire of 1906. So for the half of Jewish immigrants in this period who arrived after 1905, the housing landscape was instead dominated by streetcar suburbs. While we don't think of the US today as a paragon of public transit, except in Israel for some reason, the situation was very different and far better in the 1900s and 1910s, when even small cities enjoyed access to frequent intercity rail services, interurban commuter trains, and extensive networks of streetcars, which is what Americans call trams. Now, almost without exception, these streetcar systems were privately owned for-profit businesses, and the way they were able to make that profit wasn't by charging for rides, but by creating access to new land for development. The term suburb is actually kind of misleading, because unlike later suburbs, these were almost always medium to high density developments within city limits. But importantly, they created a huge new pool of affordable single-family housing that was usually marketed towards immigrants. So when San Francisco's tenements were destroyed, Jewish immigrants were able to quickly resettle in the newer Fillmore, Richmond, and Sunset districts. As New York's tenements were legislated out of existence, Jewish life began expanding out of the Lower East Side and into Brooklyn and the Bronx. And there are lots of other examples all over the US that I'm sure we'll encounter in future videos. It's hard to express just how much of a step up these streetcar suburbs were for most new immigrants. This is East Humboldt Park in Chicago, where my family arrived when they came to America. Now, Chicago is the most ethnically segregated city in America, and it was even worse back then. Whole neighborhoods were allocated to different groups along lines of national origin, creating internal segregation even within the Jewish community, and preserving many of the class divisions that had divided these communities in the Old World. So in the 1910s, East Humboldt Park was the Ukrainian Jewish neighborhood, which meant it was the poor Jewish neighborhood. Yet, most of the buildings you see today are unchanged from that time. My immigrant ancestors went from homes with dirt floors to this. This was the promise of America right here.
Now, I would be quite disappointed if I didn't bring up my own immigrant ancestors' background in the Jewish American agricultural movement. The idea of predominantly Jewish farming communities in America had been around since the early 19th century, but was rarely attempted until 1881 with the rise of the Odessa-based movement Am Olam. Closely associated with the emerging Zionist movement and sharing a similar ethos, Am Olam endeavored to establish collectivized Jewish agricultural settlements in the United States. The group was quick to win support of philanthropists in both Europe and the US, most notably France's Alliance Israélite Universelle. In December 1881, Am Olam made their first settlement at Sicily Island, Louisiana, only to be destroyed by a flood just a few months later. Regardless, Am Olam continued to establish agrarian communities all over the US. Most of them didn't survive the decade, but the colonies in southern New Jersey did, and most notably the Alliance colony near Vineland. My Ekhof ancestors from Kiev were among Alliance's original founders, and then later joined by my Dudas ancestors from Odessa. The New Jersey colony's proximity to New York and Philadelphia was a major factor in their survival, as was the inclusion of industry alongside agriculture. While Am Olam itself didn't last beyond the 1880s, the New Jersey community's mix of agriculture and industry provided a template for other communities around the country, such as nearby Woodbine. But as the 20th century dawned, even those communities began to struggle financially. In the 1920s, my own ancestors left Alliance for Philadelphia. A few of the agricultural settlements would survive as late as the 1970s, but even by 1930, they were a shadow of what they once had been. If you'd like to learn more about these communities, be sure to go to my channel Genie Vlogger and check out my video, Zionism's Twin Brother, Am Olam.
But that's not all. Because for a brief period at the turn of the 20th century, Jewish immigrants had yet another option. In 1903, Theodor Herzl presented the Zionist Congress with a proposal by British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain to establish a small, temporary Jewish homeland in British East Africa, the misnamed Uganda Scheme. The Zionist Congress, of course, rejected this scheme, but it did have its supporters, most especially the British delegate and playwright Israel Zangwill. So incensed was Zangwill by the Congress's rejection of the Uganda scheme that he renounced Zionism and, following Herzl's death in 1905, established his own movement, the Jewish Territorial Organization, which was almost spitefully committed to the establishment of a Jewish homeland anywhere other than Palestine. And in 1907, such a homeland was proposed by Henry Cohen, rabbi at Congregation B'nai Yisrael in Galveston, Texas. Though not a large city by any means, Galveston was one of the US's main immigration ports and saw a modest but regular influx of Jewish refugees headed out west. Additionally, Galveston had been almost completely destroyed in a hurricane in 1900. So by encouraging Jewish settlement in Galveston, Zangwill, Cohen, and financier Jacob Schiff believed they could help rebuild the city, take immigration pressures off the crowded cities of the East, and offer Jewish immigrants the opportunity for healthier, less claustrophobic living conditions. Mindful of the ongoing situation in Palestine, Zangwill insisted that immigrants to Galveston all be under the age of 40, include no single women, and be dominated by young men with the sufficient means or skills to establish a community. But because of those same requirements, the vast majority of participants were quickly drawn to the more prosperous cities of Houston and Dallas. While a small Jewish community of about 1,000 would endure there to this day, the Galveston Plan was a conclusive failure. Now, Jewish immigrants at this time didn't exist in isolation. They were just the latest wave. And like most immigrants to the US, they benefited from a wide array of communal institutions established by earlier generations. The grandfather of these was B'nai B'rith, founded in 1843 as a charity, though it quickly became more internationally focused, much like the British Board of Deputies and the French Alliance. The original charitable goals were soon taken up by the Young Men's and later Young Women's Hebrew Association, who provided a space for Jewish immigrants to look for jobs, apartments, educational opportunities, or just to socialize or exercise. If you've ever wondered why basketball had such a large Jewish presence in its early years as a sport, this is why. Finally, in 1881, just in time for the next wave of immigration, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society began providing food, shelter, and medical treatment for the most vulnerable new immigrants, as well as helping them to learn English and navigate the American legal system. They even had an office on Ellis Island. If you're wondering about these groups' use of the word Hebrew, where we today would say Jewish, the term Jew actually fell out of favor in most of the Western world around the time of Napoleon. But by the late 1880s, Jew and Jewish had come back into cultural acceptability. And you can tell because in 1888, the Jewish Publication Society formed in order to provide consistent translations of the Hebrew Bible, prayer books, compendia of Jewish law and philosophy, and other books of special interest to the community. 11 years later, the JPS's editor-in-chief Henrietta Zold began producing the American Jewish Yearbook, an annual compendium of goings-on in the Jewish world, complete with directories of Jewish organizations, profiles on the 5,000 Jews who served in the Spanish-American War, and continuously updated statistics of the Jewish population. So if you've ever wondered where I get the statistics for these videos, they're mostly from here. Finally, in response to the horrors of the Kishinev pogrom, a consortium of wealthy Jewish progressive leaders formed the American Jewish Committee. Initially a spin-off of B'nai B'rith, this was primarily a legal organization focused on civil rights. Though it mainly concerned itself with Jewish issues, the AJC also frequently worked in concert with like-minded groups like the NAACP. In fact, those two groups shared a lot of the same backers, including the activist Rabbi Stephen Wise and the aforementioned Jacob Schiff. Incidentally, this is the second time I've mentioned Jacob Schiff in this video, and it won't be the last. This period of Jewish American history is sometimes called the Schiff era, which is a sign of his importance. In addition to all these institutions, most major cities had at least one Jewish newspaper. New York had 18. The turn of the century also saw the rise of Zionist organizations like Ber Borochov's Poale Zion and Henrietta Zold's Hadassah. And, as with most other immigrant groups at the time, saloons served a major social function as a safe place for working-class Jewish men to exchange news, send and receive mail, and of course drink. Unlike with most other immigrant groups at the time, places of worship didn't occupy the same level of importance. And at the time, that was actually kind of a surprise. Judaism in 19th century America, much like in Western Europe, had been dominated by the liberal, Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox streams. While religious laxity had been the norm for American Jews for centuries at this point, most of them were religious. That was very much not what had happened in Eastern Europe, where more liberal forms of Judaism had long been treated with suspicion and only took root among a tiny minority. So for the vast majority, the options had been to hold fast to ultra-Orthodoxy or abandon religion entirely. The 1885 Pittsburgh Platform, which tried and failed to enshrine assimilationist radical reform as the dominant form of American Judaism, was very much an expression of fear that this new wave of Eastern Jewish immigrants would bury the liberal American Jewish tradition under a new regime of religious conservatism. As you probably know, that isn't what happened, though there was an early attempt at it. In 1888, Lithuanian-born Rabbi Jacob Joseph attempted to unite all the Jewish streams of New York City under a single pluralistic court with himself as chief rabbi. He was able to unite a large number of Orthodox congregations, but any attempts to push things further fell apart when Joseph established a monopoly on kashrut certification, which massively drove up the price of kosher meat and provoked a huge public backlash. In 1895, kosher butchers instituted a boycott of his monopoly, ending the last serious attempt to establish a formal American rabbinate. Instead, most newly arrived Jewish immigrants relished their new freedom from religion to an unprecedented degree. According to the American Jewish Yearbook of 1919, only 23% of American Jews were affiliated with a place of worship, compared with 91% of the overall US population. Many who remained religious embraced the more popular liberal streams, and others kept their religious tradition without feeling the need to join a synagogue or attend services. Ultra-Orthodoxy would find its place in America, but not quite yet. Another way in which Jewish immigrants stood out was their work. Generally speaking, immigrants to the US this time were disproportionately young men who came from rural areas and ended up working low-skill, low-wage jobs. Jewish immigrants, on the other hand, were much more likely to be women and children, and the vast majority had grown up in cities. As a result, 2/3 of previously employed Jewish immigrants between 1899 and 1910 reported their occupations to immigration officials as some type of skilled labor, compared to 1/4 of immigrants overall. Think tailors, carpenters, people who work with food, and other types of craftsmen. Much like the tenements, the popular image of Jewish immigrants as peddlers and newsies on Delancey Street is historically accurate, but not representative. Instead, most worked in heavy industry, particularly the garment industry, which served to place Jewish immigrants at the forefront of organized labor.
Jewish involvement in the American labor movement dates back well before this period of mass migration. In the 1860s, Samuel Gompers, a Jewish immigrant from the United Kingdom and a relative of mine, arrived in America, continued working in the cigar industry, which our family had done back in London, and quickly began moving up the ranks of the emerging trade unions. By 1881, Gompers had helped create the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. This group evolved into the American Federation of Labor in 1886 and elected Samuel Gompers as their president. But things went to a whole new level due to mass immigration. You might think that the huge influx of immigrant workers would undercut the labor movement. Business owners of the time certainly thought so, because even in the comparatively skilled textile industry, where the largest share of Jewish immigrants worked, conditions were absolutely horrific. After fleeing the Kishinev pogrom in 1903, 17-year-old Clara Lemlich began working at the Gotham Shirtwaist Factory in New York, where immigrant women were expected to work 66 hours a week for $3, a paltry sum even then, and less than half than the typical starting wage for their male counterparts. These conditions drew Lemlich and others to the newly formed International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who faced constant harassment and threats from thugs hired by factory bosses or local police, who, though unionized themselves, opposed all other labor unions. In late 1909, when the majority of workers at the nearby Triangle Shirtwaist Factory staged an impromptu walkout, Lemlich took the initiative in organizing an all-out strike across the entire garment industry. After a 4-month standoff, Lemlich and the union's legal counsel, Meyer London, were able to secure shorter hours and higher pay. Unfortunately, Triangle's owners, themselves Jewish immigrants, refused to budge on new safety protocols with disastrous results. In March 1911, 150 garment workers at Triangle were killed when a fire broke out on the factory floor while they were locked inside. In the months that followed, the factory owners evaded criminal liability in court while Lemlich was ostracized from her own union for being a communist. But just as with the tenements, the state of New York responded by instituting a slate of new safety regulations with actual teeth. Meyer London became a national hero for his continued trade unionist efforts and was eventually elected to Congress. The efforts of garment workers in New York is one of the most famous labor actions in this period of American history, but it is only one of many in which Jewish workers and activists took a lead role.
The same Jewish immigrants fueling the rise of organized labor were also helping to elevate a new generation of Jewish politicians to ever greater prominence. This was especially important because the era of mass Jewish immigration in America happened to coincide with a time of profound political change commonly known as the Progressive Era. During the American Civil War, domestic politics was divided between the left-wing Republican Party and the right-wing Democratic Party. And just by saying that, I've already made some people angry, but they'll just have to deal with it. Republicans during the Civil War made huge leftward shifts on issues of fiscal policy, monetary policy, infrastructure, and education, let alone the advancement of labor achieved simply through the abolition of slavery. However, the end of the war began to change that dynamic. Very quickly, Republican business owners who had gotten rich off of wartime industry became less and less interested in post-war Reconstruction and their party's left-leaning economic policies. So by the late 1870s, Republicans had become divided between the radicals and the liberals, later known respectively as the progressives and the conservatives. At the same time, something very similar had taken place in the Democratic Party. Since most support for the Democrats had historically come from the South, the northern faction of the party had to find a new way to keep elections competitive during the war. They did this by marketing themselves to immigrants, often recruiting them into the party straight off the boat. In exchange for their votes, Democratic Party machines like New York's Tammany Hall promised immigrants access to job opportunities, credit to start new businesses, and opportunities for their own future political advancement. However, as immigrants like Jacob Schiff began to move up the political ladder, they became more vocal in their unhappiness with the rampant corruption and ideological incoherence of party bosses like Tammany's William Tweed. So in the 1870s, the new immigrant class began to push out the old bosses and drag the Northern Democrats in a more progressive direction. The end result was a two-party system in which both parties had left and right wings. American politics was able to function like this for decades because, despite involving a slew of issues that remain relevant today, this era of politics largely revolved around esoteric monetary debates over whether the US dollar should be backed by gold, silver, or nothing at all. In any case, because of all that historical context, the vast majority of Jewish families who arrived in America during the previous wave of immigration were Republicans, while the new arrivals at least tended to be Democrats. Entering the 20th century, Jewish America was about evenly split between the two main parties. But that started to change in 1912, during one of the most important elections in American history. 4 years earlier, the extremely popular President Theodore Roosevelt had stepped aside in favor of his party's chosen successor, William Howard Taft, only to become disappointed with Taft's more conservative leadership. After being rejected for renomination by the Republican Party, Roosevelt and many of his left-wing allies then formed a third party, the Progressives. As president, Roosevelt had enjoyed overwhelming support from Jewish Americans, and for good reason. Among much else, he'd officially told off Russian Emperor Nikolai II in the wake of the Kishinev pogrom, and he'd appointed the first ever Jewish cabinet member. So when Roosevelt broke away to form the Progressives, most Jewish Republicans went with him. At the same time, a fourth major party emerged in the form of the Socialists, who were more popular than ever and even had a handful of prominent Jewish members, such as the aforementioned Meyer London and Milwaukee Congressman Victor Berger. But in spite of this, a plurality of Jewish voters, as well as voters overall, ended up supporting the Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson. Today, Wilson is mainly remembered for supporting the expansion of racial segregation in the American South, and is rightfully criticized for it. But to reduce his entire presidency to that is to misunderstand a pivotal moment in American politics. Wilson actually campaigned on a very similar platform to Roosevelt, and went on to implement many of Roosevelt's policy proposals once in office. It isn't a coincidence that the former president's young cousin Franklin Roosevelt became Wilson's Secretary of the Navy. And where Roosevelt had appointed the first Jewish cabinet member, Wilson appointed the first Jewish justice of the Supreme Court. The election of 1912 didn't end the progressive era, but it did permanently reshape the partisan landscape. Though a handful of left-wing Republicans would occasionally rise to prominence afterward, the American left as a whole began gravitating more and more towards the Democrats, which is how they ended up dominating national politics for most of the 20th century. It's also why the vast majority of Jewish Americans today are Democrats. At this point, it's probably worth discussing how the American people as a whole felt about all this immigration and the change that came with it. And for most of this period, the majority of Americans were supportive, as were their political representatives. Aside from some minor changes to the process, the system established in the 1880s remained in place for decades. Even the conservative President Taft rebuffed calls from Congress to impose new restrictions. America's foremost author Mark Twain even campaigned against the restrictions that were already in place. In 1908, Israel Zangwill finally put a name to this immigration mania with his play, The Melting Pot. The story of a Jewish survivor of the Kishinev pogrom who flees to America only to fall in love with the daughter of his family's Russian killer, the play premiered in Washington, D.C. to a rave review by President Roosevelt himself. In recent decades, the term melting pot has been stripped of a lot of its original idealism and misunderstood to essentially mean cultural genocide. This is mostly the product of self-righteous Canadians who like to pretend that their culture and history is less problematic than that of the US. The popular thing to say is, we're a mosaic, not a melting pot. But this is a distinction without a difference. It's like saying we wear toques, not beanies. Unfortunately, this misunderstanding has begun to filter into the US and has even been embraced by anti-immigrant politicians trying to present past waves of mass immigration as having been far more assimilatory than they actually were. But it's worth remembering that the person who popularized the term melting pot was a Jewish nationalist from Britain who never lived in America. And it's clear that his melting pot isn't a crucible burning away all idiosyncrasies, but a slow cooker, or wok, in which diverse ingredients are brought together to form something new and beautiful. A multicultural American society in which people are united by their ideals rather than divided by their tribal affiliations. At the same time, however, mass immigration did face growing opposition. Despite being a fully industrialized society with the world's largest economy, the US lagged far behind Western Europe in urbanization. Even as late as 1910, the majority of Americans still lived on farms or in small villages. And because of that background, a lot of native-born Americans, especially British Americans, had passively accepted the idea that their country was and always would be dominated by rural, white, English-speaking Protestants. But the immigration of millions of Jews and Catholics, and the rapid urbanization fueled by their arrival, started to challenge that self-image. People began to see the demographic shift as a threat to their own assumed place in society, and the effect on American Jews was transformative. Back in the 1870s, anti-Semitic incidents in the US were extremely rare and comparatively tame. But that was also a time when the popular image of Jewish Americans was of the educated, politically moderate, English-speaking middle class. The sudden arrival of Jewish immigrants who completely defied that image, and who far outnumbered the pre-existing Jewish community, encouraged a perception that Jews were no longer white enough for mainstream America. In real estate, Jews increasingly came to be seen as undesirable neighbors, and were subjected to restrictive housing covenants which forced them into the same neighborhoods as other unwanted newcomers, particularly Italians, Chinese, and the emerging wave of black migrants from the rural South. At the same time, most private and even some public universities place strict quotas limiting the number of Jewish students regardless of their qualifications or finances. Meanwhile, large service sector businesses became increasingly segregated between white shoe firms, which exclusively sought out white English-speaking Protestants to work at their highest levels, and Jewish firms, which at least tended to be less discriminatory. This wasn't totally a new thing. Jacob Schiff, for example, headed the segregated Jewish investment bank Kuhn Loeb, which had been around since the 1860s. But by the turn of the 20th century, this division had expanded far beyond Wall Street. Ironically, WASP firms' growing hostility towards Jews often resulted in Jewish businesses gaining the economic advantage, since they were more willing to engage with ideas and markets that the WASP firms either rejected or ignored. For example, at the turn of the 20th century, it was almost impossible for non-American authors to get published in the US. The dominant WASP publishing firms had just kind of neglected them on the assumption that American consumers weren't interested. So in 1915, a former clerk at Doubleday, who was the son of Jewish immigrants named Alfred Knopf, started his own publishing company which initially specialized in foreign authors. Without getting too deep into it, this was a very successful strategy. Even at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, Jewish businesses could play a major role in elevating overlooked talent. In 1907, 6-year-old Louis Armstrong began working for the Karnofskys, a family of Jewish tailors from Lithuania who all but adopted the young man. Through his work with the Karnofskys, Armstrong was able to buy his first cornet, eventually setting him on a path to immortality as a pioneer of the new genre of jazz. Towards the end of his life, Armstrong described his time with the Karnofskys as a revelatory experience, and it's a good illustration of some of the things we've talked about. Up to the 1900s, the Jewish community of New Orleans was exemplified by folks like Congressman Adolph Meyer, wealthy, patrician, ex-Confederate, very much relics of the Old South. By contrast, the Karnofskys, though admittedly higher up the social ladder than most of New Orleans' black population, were still subject to a lot of the same discrimination, especially the poor, who were all but confined to the same slums around South Rampart Street as Armstrong's own family. It was an experience he never forgot, and as a tribute to his early benefactors, he wore a Star of David necklace for the rest of his life. But all of that was the casual stuff. At the same time, a much more virulent, ideologically driven anti-Semitism was taking shape at the fringes of American society. In 1890, the politician, conspiracy theorist, and theosopher Ignatius Donnelly published the dystopian science fiction novel Caesar's Column. A forceful rebuttal of the popular utopian socialist literature of the time, the plot of Caesar's Column rests on the idea that Jewish and Italian immigrants are actually a vast cabal of billionaire capitalist oligarchs posing as poor industrial workers in a scheme to despoil and eventually destroy American civilization through the societal corruption of the Anglo-Saxon hymen. Also, there are airships. Lest you think this was some Heinlein-style commitment to the bit, 2 years later, Donnelly was tasked with writing the platform of the People's Party, a short-lived anti-establishment political movement that was economically leftist but extremely anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic. True to form, the party embraced many of Donnelly's conspiracy theories, particularly the assertion that the gold standard was a global Jewish conspiracy to keep inflation low and thereby keep small American family farms in debt. The People's Party was only a significant political force for a brief period in the 1890s, but Donnelly's ideas and their popularity within the movement were an early hint that the American brand of anti-Semitism was gonna be a weird sex thing. By the mid-1910s, when Jewish immigration to the US reached its peak, the idea of Jews as a corrupting influence on America's sexual and racial order finally began to enter the mainstream consciousness. In April 1913, 13-year-old Mary Fagan was found murdered in the attic of the National Pencil Factory in Atlanta, Georgia. Found alongside Fagan's body were 2 handwritten notes, appearing to have been written from her point of view and seeming to implicate the factory night watchman Newt Lee. However, police were fairly certain that these notes had been planted on her in order to frame Lee. Significantly, Fagan's body was found in close proximity to the office of the factory's superintendent, Leo Frank, a Jewish transplant born in Texas but raised in New York. Despite a total absence of physical evidence linking Frank to the murder, Frank's status as a Yankee transplant, ever-growing paranoia of Jews as defilers of white female purity, encouraged by newspaper magnate and former Congressman Tom Watson, and vague rumors of sexual misconduct on the part of Frank, which may simply have been fueled by Watson's media campaign, compelled police and a subsequent grand jury to single out Frank as the prime suspect. At the trial, Frank's legal defense team proposed an alternate case against Jim Conley, a janitor at the factory and a fellow suspect in the initial investigation. Witnesses at the factory had seen a man matching his description at the time and place of the murder, where Frank had apparently not been present. And the murder notes allegedly written by Fagan matched Conley's own handwriting and spelling. But Conley, on whom the prosecution's entire case relied, testified that Frank had paid him to forge the note, and the jury was inclined to believe him on the grounds that, as an uneducated black man, he lacked either the intelligence or the temperament to pose any kind of threat to a white person on his own. Conley also claimed on the stand that Jews are by nature perverts and a threat to white women because they are circumcised. Conley was later convicted as an accomplice to Frank, and owing to later testimony from Conley's own lawyer and a witness whom Conley had intimidated from coming forward, most historians have concluded that he was the real killer, that he murdered Fagan alone in a drunken rage after she refused to retrieve Conley's paycheck from Frank's unoccupied office, and that he forged the accompanying notes in an attempt to frame Lee. This was a textbook mistrial. The case against Frank rested entirely on character evidence, which wouldn't be allowed today, and the lone testimony of Conley. The prosecution, which was already facing criticism over its failure to prosecute a recent series of murders, presented the jury with a timeline of the murder that didn't match the police's investigation, and even sought out testimony from the jurors themselves, who, after just 4 hours of deliberations, found Frank guilty. He was sentenced to death. Frank's legal team was able to postpone the execution for 2 years through a series of appeals that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But as Georgia law only allowed appeals on the basis of trial procedure rather than evidence, these appeals had no teeth. Instead, Georgia Governor John Slayton opened his own investigation and quickly confirmed that the evidence presented could have exonerated Frank, but had been systematically mishandled and misrepresented by the prosecution. Outside of Georgia, the Frank case was a national embarrassment. Nearly as soon as the trial had ended, the Jewish service organization B'nai B'rith spun off a new communal organization dedicated to preventing something like this from ever happening again: the Anti-Defamation League. Popular opinion across the US was largely on Frank's side, and there were many timely comparisons to the simultaneous trial in Imperial Russia of Mendel Baylis, who had been similarly accused without evidence on the basis of racial prejudice for political purposes and had been acquitted. Was the US state of Georgia really more backwards than Russia? Mindful of the political climate within the state, Slayton declined to pardon Frank, instead commuting his sentence to life in prison. But even this caused a public outrage with certain sectors of Atlanta society. As soon as Slayton announced his decision, newspaperman Tom Watson published an op-ed calling for Frank's lynching. Riots broke out against Governor Slayton, forcing him to resign and flee the state. Finally, on the 16th of August 1915, Frank was broken out of prison by 28 men, including a number of state politicians. He was then driven to the nearby town of Marietta, where he was awaited by several current and former county sheriffs, who publicly hanged him from a tree. For inciting Frank's murder, Watson was celebrated as a Georgian hero and later elected to the U.S. Senate. In the aftermath of the trial, 3,000 Jews moved out of the state, and much of the community that remained entered a period of profound assimilationism and fear. By this time, the First World War had been going on for a year. Conflict in Europe had effectively ended the era of mass immigration, and while the US remained neutral, the very fact of the war strengthened isolationists and Anglo-Saxonists who preyed on fears that immigrants and refugees would only bring the Old World's problems to American shores. A few months after the lynching of Leo Frank, the Ku Klux Klan was revived, now seeking to expand their influence from the South to the entire US through a campaign of terror against Jews and Catholics as well as Black Americans. So long as the war continued, American politics, culture, and self-image persisted in a kind of stasis that cut close to the Jewish community. Progressive-era policies and open immigration remained in effect, but for how long? What would happen if the US entered the war? What would happen when the war ended? Would the US continue to be a beacon of hope and opportunity to the world, or even to its own people? Only one thing was certain. The Great Jewish American Migration was over. In 1909, the Aronow family began to arrive in East Humboldt Park, Chicago. They got jobs, started businesses, got married, and began having children. In April 1914, the last of the Aronows arrived: eldest son Jake, his wife Sarah, and their children Oscar and Ethel. The German ship on which they arrived, the Main, made its last voyage to America in June, and in August it was impounded by British authorities in Antwerp as an enemy vessel. They had just barely made it. By the outbreak of the war, the whole family was back together, except for one person, whom you won't find in this picture. When Jake and his family arrived in America, his wife Sarah had recently become pregnant, and on the 14th of November, she gave birth to their third child and their first born in America. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Liederman, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.